basically declaring Jesus is the Messiah. At that point in time, they were all fired up for this. They really thought maybe Jesus is this Messiah that we've been waiting on. Now, unfortunately, later that week, this same crowd turns on Jesus when they find out that he's not the Messiah that they were looking for, that they were hoping for, because they didn't really know what the Messiah was supposed to really be like. But that's another story, and they end up shouting to crucify him. But that's where we're at in this story. Now, the religious leaders and the cultural leaders of the Jewish people have for some time been very extremely jealous of Jesus' influence because their main goal as religious leaders was to look good in front of the people by following the law, which they interpreted through a lens of very strict man-made human interpretations of what we were actually supposed to do, the things found in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And after seeing these crowds hail Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah, these religious leaders are desperately trying to find a way to trap Jesus in some sort of error so that they can cancel him and gain back their following, gain back the crowd so that they will be following them instead of following Jesus. And so the two most elite groups of the Jewish leaders, the Jewish religious at the time, were called the Sadducees and the Pharisees. There were two camps of Judaism, extremely ultra-religious, very into following all the rules. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees did not actually get along. They held diametrically opposed views of how Judaism should be done, but they decided, because they were both losing influence, to join forces here and try to turn the crowds against Jesus. So they came up with this, some questions that hopefully they could find Jesus in an error, expose him in front of the crowds, and everyone will laugh, and then, Jesus will be no more. The Sadducees had just asked Jesus a question and been made to look stupid by Jesus' response. And so they failed. So now it's the Pharisees' turn, and that's where we pick up in Mark 12. The Pharisees decide, we're going to ask Jesus this question about the law, okay? Because they are experts in the law. The Jews identified 613 distinct commands found in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So their plan was, we're going to ask Jesus which one is the most important. There's 613. So the great thing is, no matter what Jesus says is the most important, we're going to have, well, what about these 612 that you left out? Why do you say that these aren't important? Why does Jesus tell us not to do these commandments? So they had this perfect in their mind, nothing can go wrong. And that's where we pick up. So in Mark 12, verse 28 through 31, says this: one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Okay, that was the Sadducees and Jesus, we're told in another gospel. Noticing that Jesus had given the Sadducees, given them a good answer, this Pharisee said to him, of all the commands, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And verse 30, we're going to camp out on tonight. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. All right? So Jesus answered, and we don't have time to read the rest of it, but the Pharisee's blown away because he's like, he actually even says, you know what, that's right. You really convinced me. And Jesus is like, yeah, you're close to becoming, to following me. So he shuts down the second group. But by answering this question, he does this amazing thing to tell us this is the most important thing in life: to love God and then to love others. We're going to talk about loving others next time. We're going to just talk about what does it mean to love God. Well, first off, we're going to need some tools. We're going to need some help if we're going to actually understand and unpack all that's going on in this passage. I was telling my wife this week that this is one of those passages that I've struggled with for my entire sort of Christian life trying to understand, what does this mean? What does it mean to love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength? What is the difference between all of those? What is that? How do I do that? Okay? So, I'm a linguist, okay? And I know no one knows what that is, but a linguist is someone who studies language scientifically. And I've got a lot of training in that. And so when I have questions about things, I like to look at words and try to understand, what do these words mean and what is their relationship to the other words that they're found with in the same sentence? And so that's what I want to figure out with this verse. But the problem is for us as English speakers is that Jesus didn't speak English. I don't know, hopefully someone's told you this in the past, but these words that we're reading up here, Jesus didn't actually say these words, because English wasn't even invented. This was spoken in about somewhere around AD 30, 33 probably, and English wasn't invented until 400 plus years later. So that's a problem for us because we're reading in English and be like, well, what does this mean? So what we need to do is go back to the original language that this was written in. It was written in a language called Koine Greek because that was the common language of the time, and it was probably spoken by Jesus in Koine Greek, or it could have been spoken in Aramaic. He spoke both of those languages. So if we dig a little deeper in the original languages, it will help us to understand what those words meant as Jesus said them, and then to hopefully, break that out and be a little bit more clear about what does it mean to love Jesus with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. To understand this passage before we can understand how to do it, first off, we need to understand love, right? Because that's also a problematic word. Because, we use love for a lot of things, like I love sushi. Anybody love sushi? I love cats. I love the Florida Gators. Yeah, we'll deal with that later. I love Tom. Tom, where are you at? I love you, man. I love my son. Yeah, cheer for now. I love my wife. Yeah, all right, wait, we're just cheering for everything that I love Lamp. But now we're getting but I use the same word for all of those things, but and you do this too, that the word love there, even though I used it, doesn't mean the same thing in all those places. Hopefully, I feel a little bit stronger about my wife than I do about sushi and cats. and hopefully, my love for Tom is not as strong as my love for my wife. No offense, Tom. But, so if we look at the word love, however, in Greek, the good thing was, even though, we use love in, from context, what we really mean when I say love, in English, the good thing in Greek was that they actually had 3 different words for love that meant different things. We're not going to have the time to talk about all of them, but real quickly, one word was phileo, which is where we get the word Philadelphia from. This is brotherly love. That would be like my love for Tom. We have the word eros, which is where the term erotic comes from. This is that romantic love, like I would feel for my wife. But what Jesus is talking about here, and the word that Jesus says for love here is the word agape. So agape in Greek translates to mean something like faithfulness, commitment, and a specific act of the will. So just knowing what that word love means tells us a little bit more about what it is to love God. The first thing that it shows us is that loving God is a decision, right? A commitment, an act of the will. It's an action. It's a purposeful setting of our affections. Now, this first happens at a specific point in our life, to love God. This happens at conversion, right? This happens when you realize your sinful condition. You turn to God in repentance from those sins, and you accept the sacrifice of Jesus for those sins, you start that love relationship with God. It's where you first, for the first time, love God. Okay, that's where love starts. But what does it really mean then to love God after that? What does it mean to be in a love relationship with God? Well, the good thing for us is that Jesus tells us about that right here in this verse, right? So looking at that verse again, so Mark 12:30, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Right? And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. Now that we understand what that love word means, we need to understand, well, what are those each individual ways that God tells us to put that love into practice? Right? And again, we'll need to go to the original Greek to understand that word so that it makes a little bit more sense, because it's always been a bit confusing, some of those words. And how does loving God with your heart look different from loving him with your soul, look different from loving him with your mind, and loving him with your strength? All right, so let's dive into the first one. The first way that Jesus says we are to love God is with all of our heart, okay? So the Greek word used here for heart is the word kardias, okay? So this sounds like looks a little bit like the word cardiac, right? Like if you have cardiac arrest, y'all know what that is? Like, it deals with your heart, right? We use that Greek word in talking about the heart. But you know that we use the word heart for things, especially in terms of love, not in a literal sense of I love you with the organ that pumps the blood from, and keeps me alive. No, it's an expression, right? I love you with all my heart. And what it really means, it's a figurative use then of that word. And the word kardias in the Bible is also used a ton of times, used over 800 times in the Bible. And each and every time that it's used in this figurative sense. So we're not talking about somehow finding a way to use, an organ to love God. We're using it in that figurative sense. So the figurative sense of kardias translates to something like the emotional center of your being. So for us, Jesus is calling us here to love God with our emotions, right? When God says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, he means to love him with your emotions. Now, emotions are very important to love. As you all know, you know about emotions, right? Emotions are produced by the brain. They're accompanied by very powerful brain chemicals that we call hormones, specifically like dopamine and oxytocin and other things. And they make your body feel and respond in a certain way. Scientists understand emotions as a way that our brain gives meaning to bodily sensations that are based on past experiences. So that's kind of the technical idea of what emotions are. So definitely part of loving God is feeling an emotional response to who he is and what he has done in our lives, right? A emotional response to thinking about the past experiences that God has brought us through that lead to emotions. Now, we see countless examples. For all of these, I'm going to try to point us towards or give us a specific example from the Bible on what does it look like to love God with your emotions. There's countless examples in the Bible of pouring out an emotional love to God. The Psalms is probably the best place to look. So if you don't know what the book of Psalms is, a lot of it, a great amount of it was written by King David. And these were literally songs that the Hebrew people sang, and they, talked about attributes of God throughout them. And David, throughout the Psalms, will engage with who God is and what he has done and pour out an emotional response. And he doesn't just use part of his emotions, right? He does come to God with happiness and love in that way. But he also comes to God with in times of fear, in times of anger, in times of depression. So one way that we can actively love God is by remembering, thinking about things that he has done in our lives and responding in an emotional love back to him. Right? And we just got done singing, and that's another great way of engaging our emotions in that way, just like the Psalms were. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one Jesus gives us, this is the hardest to understand from the word that's given, and the one that I had to spend the most time on and have a conversation with Tyler about. The next way that Jesus tells us to love God is with all of our soul, right? So this one's a bit harder because it's like, what even is my soul, And once I figure what my soul is, how am I supposed to love somebody with my soul? Like, I don't know if y'all have ever loved somebody with your soul before. I don't know what that means. So again, it's important to look closely at the word that was used here and its original meaning and what it meant in that culture and at that time. So the Greek word here for soul is the word psychis. Psychis. It's hard for me, some of these Greek pronunciations. But it looks like the word psyche, right? And that's a word that's kind of in our use. This is where that word comes from. Now, psychis comes from a root that literally means to breathe. And you're like, what the heck? What does that mean? Well, this traces back, if you've read Genesis, to the creation of humankind. It says in Genesis 2:7 that God breathed into Adam and Eve the breath of life, and they became a living thing. So psychis, and even our modern word psyche, has this sense of our distinct identity or unique personhood, right? Coming from God breathing in, and they are now an animate thing that is different from this other animate thing, right? And is different from all of the animals that God did not breathe into. So what does that mean? What is our distinct identity, our distinct personhood? This is a word that tries to get at the real you. Your core self, your character, your personality. So for most of these, I tried to have like one good word, and I couldn't come up with a good one. But for soul, I have several, right? So we understand this as loving God with our self, our character, our personality, our core self. So whichever one of those makes sense. This is the real you. Okay? Think about this, right? This is going to be of necessity different for all of us because we're all unique and different. Okay? So loving God with your personality is different for me than it is for you. Because God made you unique and expects you to love him based on this way that he wired you up. So for example, you may be some people are into art. Some people are into sports. Some people are really into music. Some people are really into history. Some people are into understanding hard concepts. Some people are into helping others. We could go on and on for these sort of things, but God designed you the way you are on purpose, and he expects you to use that to love him and serve him specifically. Let me give you an example that comes to mind, once again from King David. So in the Bible where it talks about, loving God with your soul, your personality, your inner self, I thought of this example of David when he danced before the Lord. So it's a little bit of a deep cut if you haven't read a lot of the Old Testament. In 2 Samuel 6:14, the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God for the Hebrews at that time, it had been stolen by the Philistines when they were conquered. And King David had just led the Israelites in a slaughter of the Philistines and had won, and they were bringing back the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And in 2 Samuel 6:14, it says that wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. Okay? Now, when David's wife, Michal, saw him dancing like this, she was ashamed. Probably because commentators say that probably she was most upset with David for how he was doing this and what he was wearing. Now, I've heard it explained before that this like ephod, she was upset because he was like wearing underwear or something. It's not really what that means here. All of the priests were wearing a linen ephod. This was like the sign of wearing a priest. That's what they were all wearing, and he wore that too. What she was upset about was that King David had taken off his royal robes, not identifying as the king, but just identifying as a normal worshiper, right? And so that's what she was really upset was about him taking off his robe and dancing in that way, right? But this was who David was, right? He was that shepherd who loved to play the harp and write songs after song after song, filling these books of Psalms with his songs of praise to God. That's who he was and what he was all about. So when he saw God's presence coming back to Jerusalem, he couldn't take it anymore and just took on the form of a worshiper and danced before God with all his might. And David famously says to Michal, I will celebrate before in response to her like telling him off, like, oh, look at you. He says, I will celebrate before the Lord, and I'll become even more undignified than this. And I will be humiliated in my own eyes, because he was worshiping God with who he was, with his soul. All right, so don't get me wrong on this. I'm not saying the worshiping of God with your soul is you should be dancing, right? Because some of us are not good at that. I'm just saying this is David's example, right? Because of who he was and how he was working. So loving God with your soul is loving him with your real you, your character, your personality. All right, we got to keep going. The next one is with all of your mind. Thankfully, this was a little bit easier. Jesus says to love him with all your mind. The Greek word he uses here is dianios. Dianios means literally your intellect, your understanding, your insight, basically your mind. Okay, cool. This one kind of works for us. But make sure that you understand what mind means. It's not just with your thoughts, right? Because the word dianios here comes from two words that help us to really understand what God means when he says, love God with your mind. Neos means mind, but it's got the other word dia added to the beginning of it. Now, dia means thoroughly, or literally it means from side to side. So when you put from side to side together with mind, you get this sense of what God is saying here. This is a mind that you have moved from one side of a issue where you don't know anything, right? Like in school, where you approach a subject you don't know anything, and you move through this studying process to get to the other side where you completely understand it and you're ready to take the test, right? So that's what this word dianios indicates, denoting moving from a lack of knowledge to a full understanding of an issue, reaching a meaningful personal conclusion. Right, so to fully understand what this word means is I chose the word reasoning, right? So the best way to understand loving God with your mind is loving him with your reasoning. So how do we do this? Well, clearly it's much more than just like thinking from time to time, yeah, I love God, right? Thought about it. Yeah, I love him. Cool. Loved him with my mind just now. No, this indicates like study, thinking, pondering on, right? This part of our love relationship with God is that you have to study, get to know God with your mind. How we do this is by reading the Bible. Tyler was just talking about this morning. I was thinking, this is going to be great. I can talk about what Tyler said. So, he was saying, how do you say that you love God and you don't read your Bible? God left you everything about who he is and wants you to be in a relationship with him. If I knew nothing about my wife, how am I supposed to love her, right? Like if I didn't spend time getting to know her. And that's God with us. He gave us his word and wants us to study it intently to love him with our mind. All right, and finally, I'm going to skip over a little bit. So there's a verse we're going to skip over. The final one is to love God with all of your strength. This comes from the Greek word, and it's got a sound that I can't quite do. Iskios. Iskios. It's more of a iskios. I don't speak very good Greek. Which literally means to have force, or a force to overcome resistance. So practically, the word iskios means power, might, force, ability. Okay, not too difficult for us to interpret. It's best understood as your full ability, your strength. Now, how I take this final one, and not all of the gospel writers include strength on this, so I take this final word in a sense of a general overarching motivation for the love and how it should be done in the three previous unique ways that we are commanded to love God, with our emotions, our inner self, our personality, and with our minds. So in each of these areas, we are to apply our full ability, everything we've got, all the force of our ableness to loving God in each of these areas. So this means directly that loving God half-heartedly is wrong. An example of this is found in the final book of the Bible, Revelation. So it's one of those scary books that not a lot of people read, especially at the beginning. But in Revelation, it's written by the Apostle John to 7 specific first century churches. And in the first 3 chapters, God has a message to each of those 7 churches. And listen to what he says to the church that was located in Laodicea. In Revelation 3:15 through 16 says this, I know your deeds, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were either one of them. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. So this church wasn't cold. They weren't against God. You know, they loved him. Yeah. But they weren't hot either. It's just like, oh, okay, yeah, God's okay, that sort of thing. But God uses this imagery of lukewarmness, right? So, you know, things that are supposed to, I'm a big stickler for if a food or a beverage is supposed to be hot, it needs to be hot. And if it needs to be cold, it needs to be cold. My wife is not the same way. She'll go to the refrigerator and eat cold things, and it's gross to me. But that's how this is, right? If you ever poured, I don't know, do y'all drink coffee? Anybody drink some coffee? A few of you drink some coffee, right? I love me some coffee, but sometimes I'll pour it into a mug, and I'll go and forget about something, and I'll come back and take a swig expecting delicious, hot, warm coffee, and it's cold, and it's, when you're not expecting it especially, we're not talking about iced coffee, right? But it's gross. Look at the word that God, the word that God used in English says, spit you out of my mouth. That's like a calm version. The Greek literally, for spit you out of my mouth, the Greek word literally means vomit. So God is saying, your lukewarmness towards me makes me throw up. That's how extreme this is, how important it is. God, when you are not loving God with everything and you're just sort of half-heartedly like, yeah, maybe, whatever, it makes God want to throw up. So you see, God demands a complete love for us, a one that utilizes the entirety of how he made us. Not just a love, that's here on Sundays while we're at Unite or whatever, but then, on Tuesday night after a terrible day at school and you made a bad grade and you're like, I don't care anymore, I'm just going to do my own thing. I don't need to read my Bible. We need to employ the full strength of our abilities to actively love God in the 3 ways that he's commanded us. Through our emotions, through our inner self, character, personality, the real you, and through your reasoning. So as we wrap up here, Tillman's going to come up, and we're going to start transitioning into a time of reflection here on this and to another time of worship. You might be worried when we start talking about loving, especially loving God, that, maybe you've loved someone in the past and that love hasn't been returned. Maybe you've loved a parent and you've never really gotten that love back. Maybe you've loved you asked someone out and it just never worked out. You're worried that if I love God, is he going to love me back? Maybe if I don't try hard enough, he won't love me back, and then, But that's not how this works. That's the beautiful thing about this. God doesn't love us based on how we love him, thank God, right? Check this out. In 1 John 4:19, John says, we love because he first loved us. It's the opposite, right? God doesn't love us because we love him. We love him because he loved us first. And what kind of love does God have for us? Jesus describes it like this: greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And then Paul extends that and uses that as an illustration when he's talking in Romans 5. And he says, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And Paul explains, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person. But, for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God, check this out, God demonstrated his love for us in this. While we were still sinners. When did he do it? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He didn't die for us when we had gotten good. He didn't die for us when we were following him. He died for us when we were actively his enemies. Not just when he didn't know us. We were actively hating him, sinning, spitting in his face. And he demonstrated how much he loved by dying for us in that moment. So because of God's great love for us, he already loves us perfectly. And our only reasonable response back is to love God back. But again, not casually, not partially, but with our whole self, with our whole ability. As we talked about tonight, with our heart, with our emotions, with our soul, meaning that inner person, your character, your personality, what it is about you that makes you uniquely you, to turning that towards God. And with all of your mind, your reasoning, digging in, spending that hard time to move from one side of the issue to the other. And to do all of this loving with every bit of ability that we have. So we should treat loving God as the most important thing that we do in our life, because that was Jesus' answer to what is the most important commandment: to love God in these ways that we've talked about. All right, let's pray. God, I just thank you for this time and this opportunity to open up your word and to help these students understand, perhaps in a new way, a difficult subject. God, we can't thank you enough for your love. God, thank you for loving us while we were still actively sinning against you. You didn't wait to love us until we got it right. And you're not up there, if we don't love you in a certain way, you're not going to stop loving us. You will never stop loving us because you loved us before we loved you. God, I just pray that these students tonight will have a better, deeper understanding